Welcome to Reliability Matters, a podcast for the electronic assembly industry. Each episode covers topics related to reliability, best practices, and environmentally responsible assembly techniques, with insights from experts across the electronic assembly industry. Now, here's your host, Mike Conrad.
And we are back. Thank you for joining me for yet another episode of the Reliability Matters podcast as we creep ever closer to episode 100. We're up there. I think this episode will be in the high 80s or something like that. I don't know the exact number at the time I'm recording this, but Happy New Year. By the time you see this, it'll be very close to New Year, so Happy New Year as well. My guest today, well, first of all, let me say I'm really stoked about today's episode because I get to talk about one of my favorite subjects in the whole world, and that is automotive. Anything to do with automotive, the whole auto industry, and in particular the electric auto industry, which is very exciting, and even more particular, the autonomous driving auto industry, if we ever get there. So I'm really excited to talk about that. And to bring in this conversation, to make it real, I brought in Brian O'Leary. He's from Indium Corporation. He's the global accounts manager. He's many things, but he's a global account manager, global head of e-mobility and infrastructure. Brian's responsible for promoting Indium Corporation's full range of products and services for e-mobility, which includes electric cars, you can see why I have him as my guest, trucks, charging stations, and more. Brian joined Indium Corporation in 2014 and has more than 20 years of experience in sales, marketing, and channel management in the electronics industry. Brian earned his master's degree in international management at Thunderbird School of Global Management. He also co-authored 2 books on thermal profiling called Profiling Guide for Profitability and Profiling Guide for Six Sigma. I should probably bring him back when we next time we cover profiling. He sounds like he would be the perfect guest for that as well. We spoke with Brian from his office in Denver. I say Denver, Colorado. Is it Denver?
Arvada, but close enough.
Arvada, yes. I'm very familiar with Arvada. We have some good friends that live in Arvada. So, you know how it's so funny, Arvada's a big town. And even though when you say Arvada, I just want to say our friends' names, see if you know them. But that's silly. That's just human nature. Where do you live? Los Angeles. Oh, I know Mary and Pete Townsend. Do you know them? Yeah. I mean, it's just funny how that happens. So thanks for joining me, Brian. I appreciate it. I'm excited to talk about the auto industry, and I have a lot of opinions and questions, and I'm just fascinated by that entire industry. So thanks for joining me today.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, of course. So one of my favorite subjects, as I have been going on about, is the electrification of automobiles. Not just electric cars, which are with us now, but completely autonomous vehicles. When I was a kid, I said this on another show, we were promised flying cars, by the year 2000. When I read see, I was the geeky kid. Instead of Sports Illustrated, I was reading Popular Mechanics and Popular Science and all that. But back in the 60s, when I would get a hold of those magazines, we were promised all these things, by the year 2000. That was kind of the benchmark when we would be in the future. And one of the things we were promised was, flying cars and self-driving cars and robots around the house, things like that. And that didn't happen. A lot of the things happened. We went to the moon. We have space stations and astronauts now, and now we're sending tourists up into space. So we did get some of what was promised, if maybe a little late. But we didn't get our flying cars. But it looks like we're starting to make up for it. Before we get into the future of automobiles, let's talk about materials, because you work for a materials company primarily. Electronics have been around since well before I was born, you were born. Do electronic assemblies in automobiles require something different from the rest of the world? The auto industry, I believe the auto industry thinks they're special, or they're unique, and they probably are in so many ways. Are the materials they need unique as well?
Well, I'm in the space of soldering materials, and we still are mainly talking about no clean fluxes, still largely rosin-based. And for the alloy, it's good old SAC, tin, silver, copper. But with electrification, EVs compared to internal combustion engines, they have longer mission profiles. And what I mean by that, in other words, EVs have higher demand or duty cycles. For example, when you fill your car up with gas, you cut the engine. It's the opposite for an EV. It's on when you're receiving a charge, and that could be several hours. So EVs also, when they're parked, they may be doing over-the-air updates and other communication. So what this all means is longer mission profiles can see more thermal cycling at higher operating temperatures. You got those extremes of both hot and cold and varying levels of vibration. So that may, in some cases, push the limits today of SAC.
Yeah, exactly. Once an electric car leaves the factory, it's on and it stays on for the life of the car. And typical, I know I read some stats about the average age of automobiles right now is a little higher than normal. That may be due to the pandemic and you can't actually buy a car right now with all the shortages. I don't know what led to it, but it might also have something to do with the fact that cars last longer. Reliability is probably at an all-time high. I remember cars from the 70s and American cars from the 70s. They were terrible. They were fast. They were cool, but they were terrible. But now I would assume that the average lifespan of a car is about 9 or 10 years. Maybe the auto industry probably targets it somewhere around there. So that those devices are on for 9 or 10 years, to your point. That is a huge duty cycle. The electronics in my car, other than the alarm system, probably go to sleep every time I take, I say take the key out. There are no keys anymore, but every time I leave the vehicle and turn it off, I'm sure most of the electronics are off. And out of that 9-year lifespan of a car, I would imagine the average electronics run for about maybe a year and a half, considering how much time it's off, how much time it's on, maybe 2 or 3 years. But you're right, there is a huge demand on the duty cycle. We rely on IPC standards and other trade organizations to provide guidelines for how we build our products, particularly in electronics. The auto industry seems to embrace their own standards. They do seem in many ways to march to the beat of their own drummer, for better or for worse. And they are a very unique industry. But then again, electrons don't care what industry they're in. They follow the same rules. The physics of failure follow the same rules, whether you're in a pacemaker or a Hasbro toy or an automobile. Will there be kind of a harmonized standard? I know there's an automotive rev or version of some of the IPC standards. But should there be more of a harmonization of IPC in the auto industry in terms of standards? Should we all be building boards the same way?
Yeah, I mean, this is a fair question. And let's be fair to IPC, which is made up of people like you and me in our industry, volunteering for the most part our time. Even if standard committees were meeting more frequently than they are today, it would still be a challenge to keep up with the pace of this industry. And I'm talking specifically automotive and the subset of EV. But this doesn't, of course, lessen the need eventually for standards, because, as you know, the lack of standards can result in higher costs of manufacturing. Case in point, I'll make 2 points. The automotive industry has been using the same standard for SIR, or surface insulation resistance, for what? 30 years. This common testing procedure has worked fine, still works fine in many cases. But for automotive and specifically in EV, we've seen a lot of change just in the last few years. So the longer mission profiles we just talked about have resulted in what we at Indium are calling enhanced SIR, to which we have developed products to meet these unofficial, I guess you could call it, higher automotive standards. So let me give a few brief examples. The current J standard 004B for SIR is 100 microohms, while the automotive industry is testing at 5,000. The current test is, I think it's like 168 hours, while industry is now testing at 1,000 hours. And the voltage back then was like 5 volts, and now it's 10, even 50 volts. So this is a case where automotive is developing their own standards, and frankly, they can't wait on IPC to come up with the standard. So they don't have a choice. Another example that we deal with quite a bit at Indium is a voiding phenomena related to the soldering process. Our industry has struggled the last several years with an IPC spec on the books, but it only pertains to the case of ball grid array. So there are many new types of packages or components that did not exist when that standard was developed. But I have some good news to report. DKE, which is a German body of automotive manufacturers, has been qualifying, or I should say, quantifying both of these examples, as I just discussed. And in the case of voiding, they've been studying the impact of voiding on components like QFNs and its relationship with reliability. So their work is expected to be adopted by the IPC and frankly should be a relief to many of us who are building for automotive since acceptable voiding levels will be relaxed. As to the case of SIR, I hear the same German body has taken up the challenge and is engaged currently with IPC. So as a manufacturer, standards help us better create products that solve real problems versus speculative ones. And as an end user, it avoids perhaps timely and costly testing. And in many cases, in the absence of the spec, as you've seen, overdoing it.
Yeah, I was just talking to a well-known expert the other day on the program, and we go back and forth. Me and my guests, various guests, go back and forth when we talk about voiding. There was a time on the show where all we talked about was voiding. It's like, can we talk about anything? Can we void the void, which is one of your company terms? But can we avoid the void? Just stop talking about it. But there are two very different trains of thought, and people are in either firmly one camp or the other. And one of those camps is voiding is a big issue. We need to do everything we can to eliminate voiding, go for zero voiding. And the other is it's all to do about nothing. 30%
Right.
voiding. So what? A lot of parts can survive with 70%, 80% voiding. You have a good intermetallic bond, enough to transfer enough heat and enough current. The part's not going to fall off if it hits a bump. You're fine. And then, like I said, there are others that are just really concerned about any void. I don't know what we did before we started using X-ray machines, because before we started using X-ray machines, there was no voiding. There was no concern. And now all of a sudden we see something and we freak out. So it would be good if it'd be good to know what it really should be, rather than based on fear, have it based on science and data. And clearly we've been building bottom terminated components, particularly QFNs, for so long now, that we probably have data on reliability as it has to do with voiding. So they can come up with either a relaxed number or a tighter number, but a number that's based on data rather than just hypothesis.
Exactly. Yep.
So it's ironic that when I look at the earliest cars made, everyone thinks Henry Ford invented the car. No. There were cars before Henry Ford. Henry Ford popularized the car and came up with efficient ways to make it. Henry Ford was the Steve Jobs back then. He was able to take something and go, that's a great idea. I'm going to make it better and popularize it and make it for the masses. But it's ironic that the earliest cars were electric cars. And way before the internal combustion engine, we had batteries and we were driving around the cities with, for the time, remarkable range and speed for the day. And we can either credit or we can blame Henry Ford for popularizing what we call ICE, the internal combustion engine. In your opinion, what is the motivation to return to the electric car? Kind of a Back to the Future kind of scenario here.
A good question. I mean, most people don't realize, like you said, the electric cars have been around a long time, well over 100 years. The main reason gasoline engines dominated over EV is the better availability of liquid fuel. Comparably, the electrical infrastructure simply did not exist back then for EVs. And, the rest is history. What is different now is the obvious motivation: climate change, which is driving policy. Europe has pretty hefty penalty on any piston engine manufacturer today in Europe, and has announced an all-out ban by 2035. In the UK, even earlier, 2030. China has banned by 2035 all combustion engines. And for the US federal government has not proclaimed a ban, but rather set targets with industry for half of all of the US vehicles to be EV by 2030. Also should note the federal fleet is targeted in the infrastructure bill. Any day it's going to be passed, and certainly by the time this podcast is listened to, I'm sure it has. Lastly, you can't forget also U.S. states are ahead typically of the federal government. New York and California are aligned with Europe and China on that 2035 cutover date. But I think equally important or more important is the consumer. Some of the new models of EVs are frankly just better vehicles than their piston counterparts. Take the Ford 150 Lightning. It's targeted as a contractor truck. But what is there not to love about a truck that a contractor can store all his power tools in that massive frunk? I love that word, frunk, or front trunk.
Yes.
It has 11 power outlets and massive battery that can charge an entire job site. And on their website, Ford breaks down the power available to meet the needs of everything from building a deck, masonry, framing a house, or I like this one, extreme tailgate party with a 20-foot projection TV, portable hot tub, HVAC, fridge, and even blender. Sounds like a party to me.
But wait, we'll throw in a blender. Be the first 10 callers.
But, we have clearly entered a new age in electrification.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to ask this question a little later, but you kind of gave me a nice segue to it. We talk about electric cars and reliability and all the cool new features, and why wouldn't we, embrace electric cars? The average internal combustion engine vehicle contains about 30,000 parts, with about 2,000 of those parts considered moving parts. When we look at an electric vehicle, they contain about 20 moving parts, and that's a huge difference, between 2,000 moving parts and 20 moving parts. So one would assume, just general common sense, logic, that that would have a proportionate effect on reliability. What's your take on that?
Well, that's a good question. Fewer moving parts, less to go wrong, right? So let's keep in mind the auto industry has really refined the internal combustion engine. They've been at it a long time. And I like to use the Japanese automakers to make a good point. I don't think anyone will argue the likes of Toyota build some of the most reliable cars on the market. I've owned several Japanese and American cars over the decades. And, the joke always was you get less frills and comfort, but you get quality. While American cars at the time, had to be broken in. It took some fixes in the beginning, but then they run forever.
Now, remember the phrase, never buy a first-year GM car. Right? Wait for the second year.
Right.
If it's a brand new model, avoid the first year, because you are
Right.
the test engineers, right?
No, you're right. Been there, done it.
Yeah.
So, but things of course have changed. And ironically though, Tesla, let's keep in mind, in the very beginning was known for ship and fix later. But they deliver today a solid product. And it sure shows with the recent announcement at the time of this recording, over 100,000 unit order from Hertz. So that speaks loads and confidence. But back to the Japanese, no one is talking about great EVs out of Japan. Actually, quite the opposite. The Mazda MX-30. It's just, you look it up because it's just scathing the reviews. But now, how about VW, who's very aggressive in EV and makes an excellent product already? And VW's approach is more get it right the first time, and it's German engineering. But their CEO, and again, this is recent news, just warned his board, if you don't hurry up and pick up the pace, we're going to lose 30,000 factory jobs at VW. So what is my take? I don't think we can really say one technology is more reliable than the other. Toyota and Tesla, representing both an ICE, or the internal combustion engine, EV in my example, both are rock solid in their category. It comes down to manufacturing processes, and in my world, material selection. For you, it could be as simple as, did they clean the board? You would think fewer moving parts means less to break, but in place of mechanical parts, you have more electronics. Some market research suggests that it could be 2 to 3 times more in the coming years. So you and I have been in this a long time, and there's plenty that can go wrong with electronics. I think if we take a very big step back, my message to our industry is just remember, this is automotive. a server board fails, maybe some kid playing video games somewhere is interrupted. In contrast, a key safety aspect of an EV is more than an inconvenience when it fails. As the EV market starts to shake out, and it will, and competition becomes more intense, there will be pressure on cost reductions, but let's not lose our heads. Some startups have very little experience in PCBA, and equally, some of their PCBA houses that have been making, let's say, those server boards may not have experience with more stringent requirements in automotive. And as suppliers with decades of experience in automotive and meeting high reliability requirements, we need to be good stewards in our industry. And it's a very exciting field, but I tell you, buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy ride.
Yeah, you gave me a perfect segue to my next question. But before I get there, comment on reliability. Yeah, internal combustion engines are highly reliable. That's what happens when you build something and refine it over 100 years. But it did take about 100 years to get to where we are now in terms of reliability. And if we look at the comparable reliability in electric cars, which have not been in continuous production for 100 years, we're there. I mean, we're pretty much on par, if not maybe a little bit better, overall reliability already. So that tells me that the days of having a good relationship with your mechanic down the road, those days are probably going to be, legacy days. My 1968 Mustang is good friends with my mechanic, right? But my future electric car, or whatever it turns out to be, will probably, it may never see a mechanic. The last tool it might see is on a factory line when it was made, and it's probably fairly reasonable to think that that's the case, unless I hit something, unless someone hits me, then it might see a body shop. But based on the fewer number of moving parts, if the auto industry can put boards together well and factor in all the potential failures that could happen with a board based in harsh environments and the actual working environment of an automobile, we may have a day when dealers, Tesla's selling cars. They don't have they don't have dealerships with maintenance bays. They sell out of malls and online. They don't have that huge service infrastructure like the traditional auto industry has. Speaking of Tesla, this is where you gave me an earlier segue. Tesla's led the way for electric cars in terms of popularizing electric cars, and Tesla's widely considered to be a tech company building automobiles. The traditional car companies, Ford, GM, Stellantis, that's a name you taught me just the other day, which is formerly Fiat Chrysler and a bazillion other brands now, Volvo, all the legacy manufacturers. They are mechanical companies or car companies incorporating electronics, right? So it's just coming from a different angle. The Tesla, particularly in the earlier days of Tesla, it's still a young company, so that's not that long ago, but in the earlier days of Tesla, there were some fair criticisms over their fit and finish. The cars worked electrically. They went from A to B. They look cool, they go fast, etc. But the door seams didn't quite, they weren't quite even. There was a little bit of a slip, kind of a shoddy manufacturing. And I think that came from the fact that they weren't auto manufacturers. They're a tech company. They got the tech right. They got the tech so right. But it took them a little while to catch up to, how to put wheels and steering columns and, whatever else, suspension systems and all that together, body panels. And I think the same can be said for the traditional companies. They have mastered the art of putting 20,000 parts, between four wheels. And they've done it very well, and the quality is just way better than it used to be. I think American cars can compete very well with pretty much any brand, from any country. The gaps have narrowed, and even low price cars still have quality. It's not like the old what was that? The Yugo. Remember the Yugo? That sold for $39.95, And the joke on that is they put the only option you can get was rear window defoggers. That way, when you're pushing your car, your hands don't get cold. that was the joke on that car. But we've come a long way since the Yugo days. So, what's your take on that? Do you think that the legacy companies still have a lot to learn with tech? And do you think that the electric companies, that all these companies that are just coming out of nowhere, introducing electric cars that have not had experience building cars before, but maybe are pretty good tech companies, do you think they have a long way to go to learn the mechanics of it? That was a long question, but sorry about that.
That's a really good question. It's really at the heart of this battle that we see between legacy and startups. So, you really have two main camps, and you identify them. You have the legacy automotive makers, and startups. And the legacy automotive have been incorporating electronics into their vehicles for years with higher and higher sophistication, like an ADAS system, a lane and park assist, increasingly more intelligent infotainment systems. This is not new for them. So they do very well on the mechanical, but many legacy manufacturers shed their in-house PCBA years ago when automotive, especially here in the United States, was struggling. We saw those spin-offs, the consolidation, companies go under as tier ones became largely the PCBA houses and system integrators for these legacy automotive. And legacy gave up some control, but got stable supply chain in return. Now, fast forward to today, this model is absolutely being turned on its head with EVs. As the barrier of entries are much lower, many startups not going to normally more experienced tier ones, but rather to EMSs for their builds. The complete system integration, largely mechanical, is giving away to more electronic space. So where does this leave the legacy manufacturers? Well, for one, VW and GM have both very publicly stated that they have target dates to outsell Tesla. I laugh, but that is a hell of a target. Meanwhile, I see today legacy is still leaning heavily on tier ones, while startups more on EMS. So what does this mean? The cost structure for both could not be more different. On the OEM side, Tesla just reported, and again, we're in the month of October, Tesla just reported a 28% gross margin on sales. Legacy automotive is probably terrified. Compare this to VW at 20% and Ford at 13%. On the supply side, tier ones that are largely utilized by legacy are making 16-18% margin, while EMS favored by startups continue to operate at those razor thin margins we all know so well. Now, throw China into the mix. And that is leading the world. China is leading the world in EV manufacturing. Cost to consumers in China is tumbling. An EV is about half of what it cost just a few years ago in the Chinese market. And this is largely due in part to their lower cost supply chain. Meanwhile, EVs in the Americas and Europe, are they getting cheaper? Nope, they're getting much more expensive. And this is nuts. Writing is on the wall. Western markets are in for a big shock when quality Chinese EVs that consumers want and will buy start to flood their markets and with EVs that compete in the mid to low end of the market. So the consumer is likely not going to be a gearhead. I think that's you and me, or earlier adopters, but rather, ones that just want to get from point A to point B. But Western manufacturers are pivoting by investing directly in new brands like Wuling that I'm sure many of your listeners maybe not heard of. Wuling, that makes a cheap city EV, has been the number one seller globally for several months. In total units sold. And their major backer is General Motors. Meanwhile, BYD, that has Warren Buffett as a major backer, is neck and neck with Tesla in sales in China. And again, in terms of units sold. So I think legacy automotive is learning from the likes of Tesla. They frankly have to adapt or they'll have a very hard time competing. I think it is interesting. The keynote speaker of the Consumer Electronics Show in Vegas, probably at the time of this recording, is the CEO of GM, and GM will be showing off for the first time their electric version of the popular Bronco on the show floor. So I'll be there.
Yeah, that's going to be very interesting. I think this is not part of our prepared questions, but I think the auto industry really ought to be concerned for a lot of reasons, because as millennials and whoever is taking over the millennial slot become of age and start making major purchases, they're not really car people, you know. And you and I probably share a lot of commonality in terms of we're kind of motorheads. You know, I think this country, the United States, had a particular love relationship with automobiles, more so than maybe some other countries, because we built giant interstates, you know, in the 50s. We expanded out in the 60s. We expanded out. We became a very car-centric culture. And the nature of our country, you know, with 3,000 miles between coasts is, you know, you gotta drive. And, you know, we don't really have, with some exception, we don't really have mass transportation infrastructure everywhere like many other countries do. You know, we just started with automobiles and we kept automobiles, and it just became sewn into the American fabric. And the car you drive says who you are to a lot of people. And some people live in, you know, a cardboard box, but drive a Mercedes. You know, they put all their money into their car because the car is their identity. As things change, as cars become more electrified and autonomous, and they may become the next version of widely distributed mass transportation. I think there's a possibility we could head to everyone has access to a ride, whether they own it or it's a lease service or whatever. And, you know, you basically just go on your phone and you say, I need to be at this address at 9 a.m. tomorrow. And because every automobile now talks to each other and all the intersections are smart intersections, it basically will deliver the equivalent of a flight plan. And the car will arrive at your house at a certain time, and you will get there at exactly that time because it's collated all that information with every other vehicle on the road. And then I think we may lose that identity. I think, you know, I don't think I'm special if I'm on a United Airlines airplane versus a Delta airplane versus an American Airlines airplane. You know, it's just a means to an end. You know, where I sit in the cabin might make me feel special, but the box I'm in doesn't make me feel special. And that may happen in the auto industry too at some point. It may become, you know, an airline on wheels, and, you know, it's just a service that takes you there. Instead of pilots, it's computers. And if that happens, that could definitely affect, you know, how the auto industry markets to consumers. Does that ever landed on you? Did you ever think about, you know, how long people will pick a $200,000 car over a $20,000 car, both of which are just as reliable, both of which take you from A to B in the same period of time, one that makes you feel good and look good? You know, is that going to go away?
Well, I think, and you make a very salient point. There's some people that a car is just transportation and that's it. So as far as an identity, yeah, sure, you'd like to have a nice vehicle, but it's really getting from point A to point B, especially those urban dwellers. You know, take New York City, for example, and parking is just obscenely expensive. Owning a car is just not practical unless you're super wealthy. So, but to your point of like the millennials, you know, lower price points, I mean, that's absolutely coming. You see that trend already. But to having vehicles show up at your house, maybe fully autonomous, that is being discussed in boardrooms. And I don't remember exactly offhand which partners are with whom, but it might be a Ford or a GM partnered with Uber or Lyft. I can't remember exactly, but they have talked about that the type of sales are not so much going to be consumer in the future, but are going to be fleet sales. So these are going to be fleet for hire, that type of thing. And in the terms of electrification, it makes a lot of sense, aside from the autonomy point, because if you have a fleet, one of the things that fleets do is they come home every night, or they have periods of time like rental cars where they're back in the bay. So from an infrastructure charging standpoint, these fleets can always be ready to go 100%. It's kind of like the scooters right now, the electric scooters you see in downtown San Diego and other cities. Before you hop on, it tells you how much power you got left. You're going to be able to do the same kind of thing. I want a car that's fully charged, or maybe I can get one that's cheaper, that's half charged, and I need it for a shorter period of time. And there's going to be a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how it comes. I wish I was younger so I could see where it's going. It's very
You're
exciting.
going for the flying car.
I'm waiting for my flying car. I am. I do fly airplanes, but I want a car that flies. So we touched on reliability and just to kind of put a bow on that subject, the reliance now. You had touched on this earlier that it used to be electronics in cars were largely infotainment. They were gadgets, and if they failed, it's kind of irritating, but it's not deadly. Now with ADAS systems, and look at my car. I have two cars. I have a 2018 GM product with all the bells and whistles, all the safety systems, adaptive cruise control, blind spot indicators, lane centering. It actually will grab. It's quite startling when it happens because it just grabs your steering wheel and moves you back into the center of the lane. Rear collision avoidance systems, front collision avoidance systems, all that stuff. And I consider myself to be a really good driver. I was a motorhead when I was a kid. The best day of my life, besides the day I got married and had our daughter, was the day I got my driver's license. That was right up there, right? And I consider myself a good driver after all these years on the road. And now, today, I don't think I'm quite as good a driver. I think I let some of my skills dull a little bit because I rely on these features. When I got my first car with adaptive cruise control, which keeps a distance from the car in front of you, I would hover my foot over the brake, just ready to take over when the system failed, which it never has. When I would change lanes on the freeway, I would look over my shoulder and look at my blind spot indicator just to make sure it was seeing what I was seeing. And it's never let me down. Now I find when I'm driving on the freeway and stop and go traffic and my adaptive cruise control is on, my foot doesn't hover over the brake. I don't look over my shoulder anymore like I used to because I trust the systems. If any of those systems just stop working, I'm a bit more in peril because I'm not relying on that. That's a huge problem in the aviation industry. Pilots kind of stop flying the plane. They rely on technology. And there was a recent example in San Francisco where an Asiana plane crashed and there was nothing broken on the plane. They had 3 qualified pilots in the cockpit. And the reason it crashed short of the runway was because someone didn't realize the auto throttle was turned off. They thought the auto throttle was turned on. They stopped flying the plane, and there was nothing wrong with the plane. It did what it was told to do, and in that case, to crash. So I think that can happen in cars. So I think that makes the reliability requirement for electronics in the auto industry life or death. It is very high. It's no longer that you can't get satellite radio if your electronics fail. Now you could die or you could hurt property, things like that. If you compare that to aviation went through the same model. They started electrifying their cockpits, making glass cockpits and all that. But the difference between aviation and automotive is aviation has the same type of computers, built for harsh environment, built for reliability, but they usually have 3, 1 primary, 2 backups. The same with hydraulic lines and all that. Cars don't have that. We don't have the budget in cars to have 1 primary and 3 backup or 2 backup computers. So I'm sure this has not fallen on deaf ears for the automotive industry. But what are they doing? We touched on it a little bit, so we don't have to go very far down that rabbit hole. But what's the auto industry doing to grapple with the exceptionally high reliability expectations? And you've mentioned already that the duty cycles are extremely long, which just complicates matters more. But what are they doing to address that, to make the electronics fail-safe as possible?
Well, you mentioned I mentioned autonomy. Some of the boards we see this with Tesla. I don't think it's any secret that the AI system that they've been building or working on, which is currently at a level 2, is a very densely populated board. There's a lot going on with the chipsets, and they do similar to, you made the example of aerospace having one primary with two backups. At least on their AI boards or their autonomous boards, they have two of everything. And my understanding is that any kind of correction or navigation in the real world, you've got one system doing computations while you have a secondary system doing the same computations. And if they don't agree, it starts over. I'm no expert in autonomy, but it is definitely a game changer, to your point. In terms of reliability, in this case, you're not going to rely on one system to drive your car. So the guy that doesn't put his foot any longer on the brake, you got to have some fail safes. But autonomy, and I don't know if you want to get into this because I know right now in your questions, but autonomy was one of the main topics of this discussion. I think maybe this is a good segue.
Yes, it's a perfect segue. The I believe that autonomous vehicles, truly autonomous vehicles, are really only possible when all vehicles are autonomous. I think one of the
Yep.
problems that AI has, as good as AI is predicting what humans will do, because we are
Right.
very unpredictable. We defy logic. You would have to build in an illogical model in order to understand humans. We have things like road rage. We have things like impaired driving, all sorts,
Texting.
texting. Yeah, we have
Yep.
all sorts of issues when it comes to human drivers.
Right.
I call those stupid human tricks. I think if every vehicle through 5G or whatever comes next can communicate with each other in real time, the aviation industry does that right now too. When there's a collision, was that TCAS? When there's a collision imminent, one plane gets a directive to go, down and to the left, and the other plane gets a directive to go up and to the right, or to their left, I guess. And basically, it happens like that, and they're given exact instructions what to do. I think if all the automobiles were connected, and not just in where they are, but where they're going, and the speed and all of that stuff, then everything can be autonomous. It would be extremely safe. The only danger of an accident is if a brick falls off a building or an equipment issue. So
Right.
what's your thought about fully autonomous vehicles? Where are we on that?
Well, I think safety is always going to have to trump a popular technology, and there are people who are I don't know, Tesla fanatics. I shouldn't say that term, but it's true. I mean, they're whatever goes. Let's try it. Let's do it. Let's forget regulation, forget everything else. We believe in the technology. I think the answer is just as much a human behavioral question as technological. Most accidents we see reported in the news in the context of autonomy is due to human behavior. To be specific, it's the overconfidence in technology, and you have a crash. And you queued that up pretty well. You've gotten more relaxed. You trust the system. And you talked about aircraft. That's great. I mean, look at autopilot. It's been used in aircraft, for example, more than a century, but you still have pilots in the cockpit, and all takeoffs to this day are still manual. Um, Tesla has gotten a bad rap. They've had over a dozen crashes into emergency and work crews, despite the flashing lights. When the semi-autonomous feature was engaged, mind you, Tesla's system right now is only a 2 out of a 5-stage progression to full autonomy. Stage 2, as defined by the SAE, says that a car can act autonomously, but requires the driver to monitor the driving at all times and be prepared to take control at a moment's notice.
That's what they don't do.
You're right. Yeah, it's like, come on, really? Many of these reported crashes, the driver was distracted. One driver of a fatal accident was even playing video games on his phone. I mean, Tesla is still A2, and Elon is saying in less than 2 months, time of this recording, it will be a 5. I mean, that's full autonomy. Nobody's in the car. I mention this because it sets an expectation of overconfidence in the technology. Now, up to this point, there's been little regulatory oversight, but this is now changing. The Biden administration just announced it's put an expert at the helm of autonomy at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, Missy Cummings. She ran a lab on autonomy at Duke well before Tesla was even around. And some of your listeners might recognize her name. She's the first woman fighter pilot.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
And actually Cummings that's a legacy name in the auto industry. There's the engine, the Cummins diesel, right? I mean, that's probably not related, but at least it's a legacy name.
But, to answer your question, I think the answer is yes. The technology someday will be here, not as quickly as many of us would like it to come, but you can't change people from being bad actors. So I think technology will be part of what addresses, as you say, irrational behavior. What that looks like, who knows? Maybe like the pandemic, you may be able to choose if you want to participate or not, but it's going to come at a cost. I mean, maybe there will be stage 5 only roads or lanes on the highway. The new HOV lane of the future is the autonomous lane. And those that choose to drive their own vehicle are denied access and will have to just, leave work a little earlier. Studies have already shown vehicles can travel faster, closer together, avoid that. You see it in California all the time, that rippling effect. Somebody taps on their brakes and it's like boom, 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 boom.
Yep.
And at the very end of the column, you come to a complete stop.
Yep.
Autonomy is going to help with that. And I'm sure, you live this all the time and I'm looking forward to it. But autonomy opens a whole new way of mobility. But to answer your question, might require a physical separation of human and machines.
Yeah, I definitely think it will. I see a day, probably not my lifetime, but certainly my grandkids' lifetime, when they may not actually physically drive a car. They may have to, if they want to know what it was like for their papa and their gran to drive a car, they might go to a car driving experience on a racetrack and get to press an accelerator pedal and a brake and have to take some training to understand how to do that and say, this is how they used to drive. They used to have to turn a wheel and push these levers with their feet. And I have a feeling that the next generation of young people that grow up to get their licenses won't get their license. They'll just be able to summon a ride or, it'll be, like I said earlier, an app on a phone. Just where do you want to be? When do you want to be there?
It's already happening. I've got kids in that that age of 15, 16 where you can start to drive. I couldn't wait till I got to that age. What was it, 15 and a half? Oh my God, I can get my license.
Right.
They care less. It's like, come on, you got to help me out with doing stuff for grandma. Get your license. And it's like,
It's a lost love. I'll tell you, it's definitely a lost love. My last question before we wrap up, it's kind of a long question, but 113 years ago, Ford released its Model T. Over the past 113 years, we've built the required infrastructure to support the internal combustion engine, including gas stations, service stations, dealerships, all across the country. This made it possible to build interstate highways, and that connected vast parts of our country. And in most of the country, we're no more than a few miles away from a gas station, for the most part. I drive a very large SUV with like a 28-gallon tank, and it has about a 600-mile range on the highway. It probably has 400 in the city, but it has about 600 on the highway. And I can never fill it these days because my credit card maxes out at $100, and I have to. The ADD in me has to put it in twice because I need to see it full. But I don't even know what it's like to fill a tank these days. But that makes it possible to make long journeys anywhere in this country and not have to worry about running out of gas. Because even a 200 or 300 mile range, I'm within the range of any gas station anywhere in the country, depending upon where I am. If we're going to transition to electric vehicles, it seems like one of the biggest hurdles is battery life and recharging options. If you're in the city, the city I live in has a couple of Tesla charging stations in local strip malls. There's 15 or 20 high power charging stations. And there's other types around. But once you get out of the city, once you're in the boondocks, there's no charging stations, or at least not a lot. And I don't know if you can drive relying solely on public charging stations. I'm not sure if you could drive an electric vehicle from one end of the country to the other in every road, like you could an ICE car. Because I don't know if there are public charging stations within 200 miles of each other or whatever the range is on your car. Do you see a day in our future when traditional gas stations will take over that for a while they'll be selling premium gasoline, diesel, and electric?
Right. I mean, it's already happening. The future is here. Convenience stores like 7-Eleven have already begun to install DC fast chargers. And they're reporting that there's going to be 500 of them by the end of 2022. And Lucid Air, I mean, they were just in the news in the month of September with their new EV at hitting an EPA range of 520 miles on a single charge. I mean, the biggest part of Lucid's story that was largely lost, this insane range, it was very much not due to the battery. Rather, it was the efficiency of all the other systems in the build. So yes, you're going to pay a premium for 520 miles with a Lucid Air, but they have proven it can be done. And let's face it, few of us drive 500 miles in a day. There are some, yes, but the average American driver drives about 40 miles per day, according to the Department of Transportation. So your home charger in your garage, for the most part, will be sufficient. The challenge, though, is competing with the ubiquity or the convenience factor of a gas station versus a charging network. Our liquid fuel infrastructure has had decades to build. Infrastructure for EV has only had a few years to get it done. But, here's an example of today and an example of the future. So let's say you run out of juice, and it's not like running out of fuel. Today, you run out of fuel, plan on walking, with your red can or calling a friend. You run out of juice, and this is not so far off into the future, another bidirectional, and that's bidirectional means you can give power out rather than just receive, you can give, or a bidirectional EV or a bidirectional tow truck could stop by and give you a jump. And your navigation will reserve and direct you to the next closest DC fast charging station. Maybe one with a lounge, check your emails, sip on your latte, while you fully charge and explain to your boss why you missed your meeting. The reality is a world of EVs will require a change in behavior, especially these early years. It's going to be messy. I think particularly messy for those EVs that don't have dedicated networks of DC fast chargers like what Tesla has built. Industry circles today is reporting that in the market, like the US and UK, you are lucky if half on any given day public chargers are working. Half. So most of the issues, if you can believe it, have to do with networking of the payment system. I mean, it's the card reader that's down. Kind of ridiculous in this day of age. There's still a lot to sort out. But bottom line, an EV user will need to think about how and where you're going to charge. But like anything, new habits take time to form, and we will transition. And it's going to be funny in the future. It's going to be like the horse and buggy to the horseless carriage.
Yeah, absolutely. There are more questions, but we're just about out of time. And this was supposed to be my last question, but I always ask 2 or 3 last questions. So let me just throw one more in there for good measure. Let's talk about scale just real quickly. I live in California, and during the height of our summer months, they'll do these I think they call them flex alerts or something, where you can sign up to get a discount on your electric bill if you agree to allow the electric company to turn off your air conditioners when needed. And they promise not to do it every day. They promise to do it only on a rotating basis. And the idea is that they'll turn off several thousand people's high amperage draw devices, and that avoids having to do blackouts, right? and they get a discount all year long for being turned off 2 or 3 times a year. With that in mind, if we all went to electric cars tomorrow and we all came home at 6 o'clock, plugged our cars into the charger, I mean, we would crash our grid. If everyone in California, 20 million plus people, just decided to plug their cars in. How do we handle scale? I know Europe has claimed that they're going to, whether they do it or not, we'll see, but, by 2035 or whatever, it's going to be all electric. They have the same problem with generating electricity. Germany has a big issue because they've gotten rid of, I think, all their nuclear power plants, and they're committed to renewable energy, which is a great commitment, but challenging. What's going to happen when we all switch over and plug our cars into the outlet? We're going to have a great world blackout.
Right. I'm glad you asked this question. I personally find this challenge the most interesting since there's still no clear solution. Consider just over this weekend, the Washington Post ran an article on how climate change is leading to massive failures already in our fragile grid. Last year, the average American home endured more than 8 hours without power. And this is according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. So that's more than double the outage time from 5 years ago. I, too, lived in California. Back in the day, Gray Davis and he was recalled as governor over brownouts.
That's right.
I also grew up in upstate New York. And I'll tell you, when the wind blows too hard or you have something like an ice storm, power could be out for days. And these are just 2 states, and combined are over a quarter of our GDP. And their infrastructure, frankly, is not that great. Both also, though, have very ambitious electrification targets. Do I think they will keep up? No one thinks we are ready. So it's going to be a bumpy road. But, what is the answer? For one, DC fast charging is a must. Right now, most people who own an EV are fairly affluent. If you can afford a $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 plus EV. And the demographic is often a homeowner with a garage where you can install easily a stage 1 or stage 2 charger. It uses your existing infrastructure. But if you live in the city or a multi-home dwelling like I do, an urban environment, home hookup is not possible. So, having access to a stage 3 charger, and that's that DC charger, it's usually 300 volts or more, can get me charged and going. And I can, hit the convenience store for a cup of coffee and fire off some texts while I do it. But to your point, peak demand is a real concern. But there are plenty of potential solutions. One is purely regulatory, as you mentioned. Charge more during peak, incentives like here in the state of Colorado to charge only off peak. Another solution is the bidirectional technology I had mentioned earlier. This will allow you to charge from the grid, but also give back a charge when not needed. And many EV car makers like VW sell all of their models now with bidirectional charging. And the German government, for example, is seriously envisioning using millions of parked EV batteries that are in the car, not being used, as a way to better balance the grid. And here in the US, and this is interesting, we're kind of unique in many countries in the sense we have fleets of school buses. And they're kind of a no-brainer, low-hanging fruit for electrification. Having huge batteries, they mostly sit around all day doing nothing. And these buses have the potential to act as a microgrid, powering small communities in times of like an energy distress, like an ice storm in upstate New York. I could even see schools using this as a potential revenue source. I mean, let's get imaginative. Forget selling that crap to kids and vending machines to raise funds. Make money off of selling power back to the grid. I mean, it's a cool time we live in.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept because right now, one of the challenges with a power grid is they can't store electricity. They have to make it and use it at the same time. So it is a very fine balance between overproduction. It's think about a supply chain issue where you had to make it at the exact time the consumer needed it. I mean, that is way more than just in time, right? That is just you couldn't do that. But in the electric world, that's what happens. But if you're right, if everyone had a battery at home in a car or a battery wall or whatever the case may be, then they could overproduce a little bit when conditions are right, and then rely on some of that stored power for the shared grid when a power plant has to go down for maintenance, or tornado took out some wires, or whatever the case may be. Yeah, that's an interesting proposition. And then you buy electricity and sell electricity. It becomes a tradable commodity.
We've already done it with solar. I mean, it exists. These models exist today. And personally, I'm very excited about energy storage. Many of these lithium ion batteries are going to need to be replaced in EVs. I mean, I think the average life expectancy is about 10 years, but many of these vehicles are going to go on beyond 10 years. So they're going to get a new battery pack. But you can find a second life for these batteries in energy storage that don't have that, requirements of having a full charge, which results, directly equates to range. It's a battery storage unit. So you could use batteries that are not as, have as high as capacity.
Sure.
But, the other part is lithium ion is no longer the only game in town. I mean, LFP, or the older lithium iron phosphate technology, has seen some remarkable improvements, and even Tesla is starting to use them. Today, they are already super cheap to produce. And what this means for energy storage technology, most likely you're going to see like ocean container like modules or bricks that will complement a DC fast charging station. It'll be sitting right next to it, and it will be storing that energy off peak, and it will deliver it at peak from storage rather than directly from the grid. So what is also exciting about energy storage, and it complements renewables like solar and wind. And one of the things not really talked about right now is how EVs today are still getting most of their power from dinosaurs. I mean, it's fossil fuel generation.
Coal or natural gas power plants. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, and I think as consumers and policy demands a shift to renewables, I mean, it's going to come around. There's going to be a lot of pressure for providers. And here in the United States, there's over 2,000 power providers, and a lot of them are pretty antiquated. And they're going to have to prove that the source of energy is coming from renewables. Well, having something hooked up to energy storage unit, it just makes it a bit easier.
Yeah. Well, we live in a very exciting time. I want to live to be 200 years old so I can see what's happening. I'm so curious. We're almost there. I feel like we are almost there to my flying car promise. Maybe not literally flying, but certainly flying down the road on clean, renewable energy. I think that's such an exciting promise. And the automation side of the automotive industry is just really exciting, to me, quite exciting. Even though, if given the choice, I will always drive versus be driven. But it is nice to be able to take your hands off for a while and read a paper or whatever it is you want to do safely. And I think we are almost there. We are almost there. Well, and I do appreciate everything Tesla's doing. They're rule breakers. They're the proverbial bull in a china shop, and they are clearing a path for the legacy car makers to follow. And I don't know if Tesla will still be here 20 years from now, or if they are just clearing the path, if they're the icebreaker and the rest will take over and dominate. I don't know, but I know and I appreciate what they're doing, even though they're definitely on the leading edge. When you're leading edge, you're gonna make some mistakes, and everyone will be better off for it. But it's just an interesting time right now. Brian, I really appreciate you being here. Thanks for all your wisdom and your knowledge in this business. I would love to sit down over a beer or two and talk about cars in a better environment than just looking at pixels and tiny little screens. But I appreciate you being my guest.
All right. Thank you. And thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Thanks for listening or watching the Reliability Matters podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app, such as Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and so many more. Also, be sure to check out my other podcasts, including the Concept to Creation podcast, where I feature conversations with entrepreneurs within the electronic assembly space, and the Innovations in Technology podcast, where we discuss innovative products within our industry. All 3 shows are also available in video format. Check out the Reliability Matters or Concept to Creation or Innovations in Technology podcasts on YouTube. Just search the show's name and you can find all 3 shows. Or go to MikeConrad.com. That's Conrad with a K. All 3 shows also appear there. Again, thanks for being part of my podcast family. I appreciate you being here. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay happy. And of course, keep doing it right. See you again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Reliability Matters podcast. Join us on the 2nd and 4th Tuesday of each month for new episodes of Reliability Matters.